Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. 2025 is a significant year, for Singapore, SG60. It's also 80 years since the end of the Second World War. So I think this is an opportune time for us to ask three sets of fundamental questions. The first set has to do with Singapore. How far have we come in 60 years? What were the factors, endogenous and exogenous, that brought us here in this shape? The second set of questions I want you to think about is, what does the current state of the world, in particular its volatility, the turmoil, the news headlines, the drama in the world, what does this portend for Singapore? And the third set of questions, how should we respond? What does the future hold for us? And what would be a sensible response to this unfolding future? Okay, so let's get on to the first set of questions. How far has Singapore come? What were the endogenous and what were the exogenous factors for our journey and our success so far? In 1972, Singapore's first foreign minister, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, delivered a speech which is well worth reading even today. And this speech outlined his vision, and I think he coined the term global city. He argued that because Singapore was so small, no hinterland, no natural resources, he made the case that Singapore had to become a world-embracing city. And Mr. Rajaratnam was a wordsmith, so he created a word which I had never seen before called ecumonopolis. I think for today's discussion, global city does it. But I'm making the point is that this concept of going and leaping beyond our immediate limitations, boundaries, and neighborhood was in fact ahead of its time, but one which has served us very well. In other words, Singapore embarked on hyper-connected globalization before it became conventional wisdom, before it became the standard formula for rising cities and countries throughout Asia. We, therefore, were pre-positioned for the last 6 decades of globalization. In particular, we seized the opportunities presented by Pax Americana, which has in fact been around for 80 years, because America was the ultimate winner of the Second World War. But it was a very unusual and beneficent victor. You think about the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Germany. You think about the rise of Japan. It was a very unusual win. Of course, it helped that at that point in time, 1945, American share of global GDP was 40%. And therefore, anything which led to peace and prosperity and growth in global GDP, 40% would accrue back to the US. So Pax Americana, going back 80 years, offered a vision of a liberal world order. Liberal in 3 separate but related senses. Domestically and politically, it meant freedom of choice. It meant some adherence to the concept of human rights. And in particular, it meant some form of democracy. That's the internal dimension. The economic dimension to liberal world order was free trade and global supply chains. And of course, it's no accident that these were the decades when American multinationals were expanding, were building global supply chains. Globally, the third dimension of a liberal world order was the establishment of international norms and international law, international institutions, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, with a mandate to secure peace, provide conducive conditions for prosperity, and to provide global public goods, to deal with what would otherwise be the tragedy of the commons. By that, I mean dealing with pandemics, dealing with climate change, law of the sea, protection and exploitation of intellectual property, the protection of biodiversity, etc., etc. So the point here I'm making is that Singapore thrived in such a conducive world. In 1965, Singapore's GDP was US 1 billion. One. Last year, our GDP was just over US $500 billion. On a per capita basis, our per capita GDP has grown from $500 US in 1965 to around US $85,000 today. A remarkable once-in-a-lifetime feat. Our trade to GDP ratio regularly hovers around 300%, a ratio which is off the scale for any other country or city, meaning that trade is our lifeblood for our economy. It's not just an ideological point or a negotiating point. It is our lifeblood. But bear in mind, the true success of a country is not just GDP growth, not just the economy, but also the strength of our social fabric. In Singapore, the last 6 decades, we have built a unique, cohesive Singapore identity, forged from a very diverse set of multiracial, multilingual, multireligious society. Again, an achievement not to be taken for granted. We've got some of the world's best healthcare, education, housing, savings, and retirement schemes in the world. And with the recent Forward Singapore exercise, you know that we are also refreshing our social compact to make sure that no Singaporean is left behind and that seatbelts are on at a time when we know that the near future may be a roller coaster ride. I say all this not to beat the drums of triumphalism, but to urge, in fact, introspection, humility, and reflection on the foundations of Singapore's success so far. Let me cite a story to illustrate it. In fact, this backdrop, if you were to erase this and take the entire panorama of this backdrop. In 2004, I took a boat cruise which took off from Clifford Pier together with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Mr. Lim Kim San. In 2004, we had not yet decided whether to have an integrated resort. Nevertheless, we wanted to explore options. So Mr. Lee, Mr. Lim, myself and our staff took this boat cruise to the southern islands in Sentosa and then came back. Marina Bay in 2004 was not yet a reservoir, so our boat could go in and out. And I remember as our boat returned to the marina, it was sunset, and against the backdrop of our skyline. Now remember 2004, basically most of this site did not exist. the other side existed. And we could see Fullerton, the old GPO, now the Fullerton Hotel. We could see Clifford Pier. We could see the buildings of Shenton Way. And I couldn't resist asking Mr. Lee, how does this make you feel? Knowing that 50 years ago, this beautiful skyline looked very different, and most of these buildings were not here. How does this make you feel? I was hoping for some profound answer. Mr. Lee, in his usual prosaic, almost gruff way, simply muttered at me, a hardworking and disciplined people built all this. That's all he said. A hardworking and disciplined people built all this. I should add the coda to a hardworking and disciplined people with no natural resources, with backs against the wall, is that that can only work if they're also led by competent, honest, imaginative leadership. So I'm positing that it is the people of Singapore who was the key endogenous factor of success. But that is not enough. The second point is exogenous somewhat. Meaning, of course, we have a strategic location at the southern tip of the Asian continent, where the Straits of Malacca flows, connecting the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. But now that the Panama Canal has been in the news, I've been doing a bit more research into the Suez Canal. And it is worth remembering that it was only after 1869 when the Suez Canal was opened. Only after that did the Straits of Malacca become the shortest route for ships between Europe and Asia. Before 1869, the shortest route is in fact through the Sunda Straits, not Singapore. So geography and things that happen far, far away have profound impact on our opportunities. Just last week, the Maritime Port Authority announced that Singapore's container port throughput had exceeded 40 million TEUs for the first time. And vessel arrival tonnage also hit a new record of 3.11 billion GT. So we're still in that business. But we also know that with climate change, and if the Arctic opens up, the shortest route will not be the Straits of Malacca, it'll be through the Arctic. Third point I want to make is that we in Singapore have always had to make ourselves useful and relevant to the world. We've had to make common cause with our neighbors and beyond. We've had to consistently uphold international law and the sanctity of contract. Not just because it feels good to be honest and reliable, but because being honest and reliable gives us that competitive advantage to take full opportunities that come from our strategic location and to give opportunities and livelihoods to our people. Now, that's all the last 60 years. Let's fast forward to today. Because the point I'm making is that many of the factors, the liberal world order, the global supply chains, the growth of multinationals, peace in our region, a stable global balance of power. A lot of these prerequisites for our past success are now severely eroded. And so the world is now at an inflection point. In the years immediately following our independence, the US presence in our region was key to stopping the march of communism. At that time, there was this theory of falling dominoes. And the US presence also encouraged both growth in trade and investments. That's why it's no accident that even today, the US is the largest source of foreign direct investments in Singapore by a long way. The other turbocharge for our success was that in 1978, China under Deng Xiaoping embarked on reform and opening. And therefore, Singapore had the best of both worlds. Pax Americana, reform and opening of China. And after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the world entered a unipolar moment. And again, can you see how we were optimally poised for the opportunities that resulted? But history does not end, contrary to books published at that time. And the world does not stay still. And we all know that unipolarity, in fact, is now being replaced by multipolarity. It's not just about the rise of China, but the emergence of multiple poles, including the EU, the Middle East, and in due time, South America and Africa. At the same time, there's been this shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. We are also witnessing at a domestic political level all over the world an erosion in trust in domestic political systems and in international institutions. We are witnessing increasing levels of polarization. We can discuss why later. And the bogeys of inflation, inequality, immigration loom large. And so the isms have returned. Nationalism, protectionism. In fact, last year, 2024, I think more than 60 countries held elections. And it is very sobering, including for us here, that of these 60 elections, 1/4 of those elections resulted in a change in the ruling government. And even in those where the incumbents came back, they witnessed a significant erosion in political support. So many incumbents, including India, Japan, France, South Africa, lost significant vote share. Within the G7, there are new prime ministers in the UK, France, Japan, soon Canada. And there will be elections in Germany in February. So the point I'm making is that politics everywhere, in fact, is local. It is local citizens who vote, not international cosmopolitans. And we're living in a world in which at the domestic level, there are deep anxieties about globalization, multilateralism, and free trade. The Princeton University political scientist, John Eikenberry, and other commentators have pointed out that all the superpowers are now revisionist powers. You know, it used to be thought that it was the people on the other side of the Cold War, the Soviet Union or Russia, or maybe to some extent even China, that were revisionist powers because they felt they were not adequately represented at the table post-World War II and didn't get sufficient rule-making ability or representation. But actually, the big news today is not actually Russia and China, but the fact that the United States is now challenging the very system that it envisioned, underwrote, and protected with blood interest. Now, I say this not in a pejorative sense. I do not want to start a quarrel with any superpower, but to say that John Eikenberry's analysis is salient and bears thinking about. Another tectonic shift that's occurring while the geostrategic earthquakes are occurring is that we now have simultaneous interlocking, mutually synergistic technological revolutions in digital technologies, especially AI, in biotechnology, and in sustainable energy. And these are not separate revolutions, but they feed, interlock, and empower each of these three revolutions, which obviously are going to present both huge opportunities and significant dangers if we are not aware and if we do not pay attention to how to deal with threats, to protect the global commons, and at the same time to have an equitable distribution of opportunities. So let me come to the third and final set of questions. Given the state of the world, given the ongoing dislocations and disruptions, how should we in Singapore respond? What is a small, hyper-connected, hyper-globalized city-state like Singapore do in a world that is more suspicious of globalization and its benefits, and deal with the technological revolution to boot, and deal also with maintaining and forging cohesion, consensus, without erasing diversity, but making sure there's enough center of gravity in the middle? These are profound challenges. I would say, firstly, for Singapore, we actually have no choice. We need to remain open, inclusive, and as far as foreign policy and alignment is concerned, we need to maintain an omnidirectional balance and productive and constructive engagement with all powers, big and middle. In 2015, at the S. Rajaratnam lecture, then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong made a point that our foreign policy, in fact, is actually a balance between realism and idealism. Think about that. Realism and idealism. Realism because we know we have to take the world as it is and not as we hope it will be. But idealism because we resolutely refuse to surrender to our fates as a small state, and we insist that we still have agency and we will defend ourselves and advance our interests. Now, words may be easy to articulate, but translating this, defend ourselves and advance our interests, that is the real challenge. There are some things that have not changed in 60 years. We are still tiny, no hinterland. We are still a low-lying city-state. The sea levels will rise. And we don't have a domestic market. All these fundamental realities have not changed. And the point is, and speaking as a foreign minister, if Singapore was not successful economically, if we were not able to defend what is ours militarily, if we were not united despite the inbuilt diversity of our population, no amount of brilliance, erudition, sophistication in negotiation will give us a table, will give us a seat at the global stage. So the point is unity, success, the ability and willingness to defend and to stand on our own 2 feet remain absolutely essential, perhaps even more essential going forward. The other point, which I've made in the past, is that Singapore must not allow itself to get into a position where we can be bought or bullied. And therefore, there must be no mistake about our determination to unabashedly pursue and prioritize our long-term enlightened national interests, and that we will defend our sovereignty. We do not depend on overseas development assistance. We do not expect any foreign troops to shed blood on our behalf. That's why we have national service. That's why we spend 3.4% of our GDP on defense. But we also seek to make common cause, because especially with our immediate neighborhood, so ASEAN remains a key pillar, both in terms of economic opportunity as well as keeping the peace in our neighborhood. And we will continue to play a constructive, relevant, and salient role on the global stage. So that means the second point here is that we have to continue to reinforce and refine the rules-based international order, even though it is no longer underwritten by a single hegemon or the current set of hegemons have not yet worked out a modus vivendi to protect the global commons. But for what it is worth, for Singapore, for Europe, South America, Africa, the Middle East, there are still major parts of the world who depend on the rules-based international order, who will depend upon adherence to international law, behaving within global norms, and having peaceful resolution of dispute. And we need to do all this whilst also dealing with the opportunities from AI, biotechnology, and energy. My third point is a bit more inward-facing. I have served 3 prime ministers. I have been up close for 2 prime ministerial transitions, from Mr. Goh to Mr. Lee, from Mr. Lee to Mr. Wong. So let me tell you, as someone who has been around for some time, and as the foreign minister now, every time there's a transition, there will be a test. We may not know exactly when or in what form, but there will be a test. And we must expect the new leadership team to be probed, to be pushed, to be assessed. Does the new leadership team have the spine, the courage, and the gumption of the past? And the second test a new leadership has to pass is, does the new leadership have the support of the people? And in the face of these challenges, both the leaders and the people have to rise and answer these fundamental questions. We'll have to look out for each other. We'll have to maintain unity. We'll have to strengthen cohesion. We'll have to retool, reskill, reboot our economy. And we will have to continue to make common cause. Let me end by quoting Madeleine Albright, a brilliant lady whom I had the privilege of meeting more than once. You know, she was also the Secretary of State of the United States. And there was one speech she made. I think she was speaking off the cuff. And she said, you know, diplomacy is not a quiet game of chess where you have 2 people quietly contemplating their moves, taking your turn, you take your move, the other party makes another move. She likened diplomacy and world affairs to the game of billiards. When you strike a cue ball, you have some idea of what you want to achieve. But actually, you're not just hitting one target. And the moment your cue ball hits more than one ball, which is almost always the case, there will be a chain of unintended and unanticipated consequences. And in a volatile world, where not everyone's going to wait their turn to hit the cue ball, right? And everyone is just having a go, we are guaranteed to see more uncertainty and more unpredictability. But that's not all, because the point I also want to leave you with is this thought that diplomacy is not a one-off game. It's not one deal, and it's not zero-sum. In game theory parlance, in fact, foreign relations and diplomacy is a set of, quote, infinitely repeated games, unquote. Infinitely repeated games. It's Chinese New Year next week. And, it's a good reminder that perhaps it's not chess and it's not billiards we should be thinking about, but the game of mahjong. Because mahjong, especially in Asia, is a series of infinitely repeated games. What are the implications of playing a series of infinitely repeated games? It means it's not a one-off deal. It means you are actually trying to work with other people. And the more predictable, the more reliable you are, you would probably get better results in the long run. So the optimal strategy is to play fair and straight on the basis of reciprocity, trust but verify. And if anyone cheats or gets out of line, the other players will know what to do. So those of us who participate in this great game of diplomacy must endeavor to keep everyone at the table, take a long-term view, to work collaboratively, to uphold the rules, and to insist on a fair and equitable treatment. So I come back to SM Lee's point on realism and idealism. So Singapore will stand on our own 2 feet. We will defend what is ours. We will take a long-term enlightened view. We will make common cause with partners and supporters and potential and hopefully an expanding pool of partners. If we fail to do this, the alternative is a more chaotic, unsafe world on a global stage and a divided and polarized domestic body politic. We've witnessed this in other parts of the world. We know what to avoid. So this is an exciting time to be alive. On that note, let me invite questions and comments.
Excellent. Thanks. Part of the uncertain, dramatically changing world is that we had much more of a speech than I originally thought. I want to value that because I think Vivian's painted a very strong picture, not just of the dynamic change in the world, but exactly how do they intersect with our country's history and our country's forward-looking positions. And there are some big questions that arise, and he's provided at least the seeds of some of the responses he sees, both internationally, but particularly domestically. In the last some parts, I thought elections are coming up, but
it will have to come up by November.
That's right. So I didn't say exactly when, neither did Vivian, but yes. So we've therefore had less time for questions and answers. I'll cede my time over to the audience, but I just want to ask perhaps one question, because you've taken a very long view, and we're always used to thinking of you as the young minister, at least because we're the same age.
We're old.
I'm past 64 now. You're coming up soon. But if I could ask you, if we were to go back to your teens when you were, getting into reading Time magazine, looking at the world, and then, AI, you mentioned AI and technology. I still remember you used to make your own computers.
Yeah.
If you look back 50 plus years, what's the thing that's probably surprised you the most?
Well, both of us are 64 or will be 64. If you think when we entered NUS in 1980, there was conflict in Indochina, Cambodia. First, 1975, the fall of Vietnam to the communists, Cambodia, and then the Vietnamese interaction with Cambodia subsequent to that, 1978. 79, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Yes.
And again, in 1980, we were still in the initial growing phase of the growth of multinationals and global supply chains. And even then, the campus politics then consisted of two different streams. One was, these multinationals are exploiting us. Another was, look at all these foreign invasions. And are we going to be part of this falling dominoes? Well, by the end of that decade, Berlin Wall had come down, the Soviet Union had collapsed, Indochina had settled down and was able to become part of ASEAN. And then we had good decades. And then after that, the unipolar movement, but you know as well as I do, unipolar movement didn't last all that long. And every success carries with it seeds for its own creative destruction. So now, at this age, I think we've seen a full cycle. And again, the appeal for humility, for introspection, and for care and taking a long-term view. So that's, I reflect on my own life. Those are the lessons I've drawn.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the floor, but there are already some people who registered some questions when they signed up for this talk. And one of them, I think, pulls from what Vivian's been talking about, that among all the great powers, he's mentioned ASEAN, our region, and then he's also, again, in response, talked about how our region has settled quite nicely, belatedly, not as pre-positioned as us, but the others have sort of turned similarly. Could I ask you, try to pull the parts together, this global change, especially in America and Trump, how much does ASEAN be that third billiard ball or fourth billiard ball? I mean, there's the great power relationships, and then there's...
The one lesson that ASEAN learned from the earlier decades was never again to allow ourselves to be an arena for proxy wars. So the Vietnam War is an example. Because frankly, yes, you could say at one level it's a fight between communism and capitalism. But actually, I think with now that 50 years gone by, these were really wars for nationalistic purposes, for independence. Right? So I can tell you that all my colleagues in ASEAN say, no, we will not be an arena for proxy wars. The other thing which we have discovered is that actually, regardless of how the rest of the world goes, if we continue to lower trade and non-tariff barriers, if we continue to integrate our economies, if we continue to invest in infrastructure and connectivity, we've still got several good decades to come. And with this growth from these good decades to come, ASEAN has realistic prospect collectively of being in the top 5, top 4 of the world.
Economies,
which is not a bad prospect. I mean, the UBSs of this world will still want to do business here and have an office here. So we are very aware of what not to do. We're also very aware of our potential. And I think, at least based on my intensive interaction now for almost a decade with my ASEAN colleagues, we know what to do. So even if the rest of the world retreats, I don't think you will see ASEAN retreat.
So further integration in ASEAN certain unity and common points about how to deal with the rest of the world. Now, as I said, we'll take some questions from the floor so we get some. I mean, you all are here. Some of you had to stand for an hour.
Sorry.
So, no, it's good that they're all enthusiastic. Shall we take the second row here? Can I have a microphone over here? Sure. Satya is one of my council members. Please.
Hi. Thank you, Minister. I think you always inspire and your passion comes across very well. My question is, really following up from what you said early on in your speech, backs against the wall. And I think backs to the wall. I think one of the things we are seeing is we are in an appropriate place, wealth management place. And we've built a lot of wealth as a country. And when I interact with some officials, I'm sure this paranoia, which you've spoken about in your earlier speeches, is there in the cabinet. I'm not entirely sure it permeates through the system. So to make ASEAN a real project, I feel risk-taking is important. Has that risk-taking come down because we want to protect our wealth and we have to take risk? Thank you.
Well, there's no doubt that after 6 decades and 6 conducive and successful decades, wealth has built up. Now, there's several ways to unpack that phenomenon. First point I want to make, and I think in this audience you'd agree with me, the return on capital has probably exceeded the return on labor the past couple of decades. Now, without getting into the why and the moral or ethical aspects of that, let's just take that as an observed phenomena. And because Singapore, the government has almost always run surpluses in a budget, we've built up significant sovereign wealth. And in fact, it's now the dividends, the returns on the sovereign wealth is now a major revenue item on our budget. So I sometimes remind my foreign counterparts, the reason why we have generally lower taxes is in fact because we have got the sweat and savings of our forefathers, right? But the point now is this, with these revolutions going on, do you think there's going to be further increases in return on capital? And if there is, isn't it better to be a country which is a net creditor with significant reserves, invested intelligently and responsibly across the world in what we believe will be the opportunities of the future presented by the revolution? But at the same time, while you do this, and you follow the logic of the market, have a care that we are not a corporation. We're a country. We're a city-state. We're a nation. And that must mean leaving no one behind. It must mean enhancing the capacity of our people to fully exploit the opportunities of the future. So can you see, in the 20 years in which Prime Minister Lee was in charge, actually, we had a significant expansion of social security, of savings, of healthcare, the intangible side of that ledger. No doubt enabled because first we had the resources, but also because it was the right thing to do. And in fact, prepares us for this roller coaster where we now have to embark on. And your point is right. There will have to be more risk. And we cannot become a completely risk-averse society, a rent-collecting economy, just aiming for the lowest common multiple. So this attitude of both stewardship and responsible risk-taking, of both following the market and yet understanding that the market is a means to an end, and ultimately fulfilling social and human goals. We need to keep getting the balance right. And as the global situation evolves, that balance point, we need to shift, and shift quite dynamically. So Singapore's future will depend on how well we're able to shift.
Thank you. So I think in his speech as well, he emphasized some things are perennial, some things are consistent, and other things will have to evolve. I think that's a balancing point.
But actually, we're in a much better position than 1965.
Yeah.
You look at the reserves, you look at the education of our people, you look at our ability to work not only within Singapore, but across Singapore and make common cause. I think we're in a much stronger position. But having said that, we're also facing a much less conducive international environment. So that's my point, you see. Realism and idealism and being pragmatic. Those are the key attributes of Singapore.
Now, you warn us against hubris, but I think what you're talking about reflectiveness, and also along the way, you've mentioned that we're both 60-something. So I'm looking for a face that's a bit younger to tell us a bit question about whether you're optimistic or pessimistic and, why or so. Would anyone like to do that for me? Cheryl Tan from Amazon Web Services.
Sorry, I need to correct Professor Simon from Cheryl from Amazon.
Sorry, Amazon. Yeah, got it wrong. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Minister.
Hi.
Thank you for your speech. I actually really enjoyed your analogy of the mahjong session. I think it's very appropriate. But as you mentioned, it's a changing world order with US also being a revisionist power as well. Given that Singapore has based its success on the traditional world order which US led, which is also changing, while we sit at this mahjong table where a lot of the other powers or other countries are also changing their way of approaching the world, are we also at the table of mahjong also changing with them? And are we also prepared to move into a new stage of world order where the US is also changing along with other major powers? So that's my question. Thank you.
Well, we have to accept that the world is changing and that they will always be larger than us and superpowers, and we will always be the big player at the table. I mean, that is a reality. But the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, the situation has changed, but it is all equally true that we are in a stronger position than we were in 1965. And we must be realistic enough to know what we can't change. We must also know what our perennial existential vulnerabilities are. And then we must seek, through a combination of uplifting our own people, demonstrating that we are prepared to defend our own interests. And then, as a matter of good faith, working with our neighbors especially, and with the other poles of power. And I've mentioned, I repeat them again, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and South America. In fact, if you start checking the travel schedules of our prime ministers, and in fact, the ministers of Singapore, you will notice now we are traveling off beaten tracks. So that has to be the approach. So what I would say is there's no point, pontificating and lecturing to superpowers. And they will do, they have the luxury of being strong and of doing what they will and expecting the weak to suffer what they must. We, however, making the counterpoint that if we are smart enough and open enough and collaborative enough to make common cause, we still have agency. Yeah, we still have options, and we still have chips.
I may try to underline what Mr. is saying. Besides America and China, which are very well known and we engage them fully,
Yes,
he's already mentioned the EU and India and ASEAN.
yes.
And in the last few years, his travel schedule has gone wilder and further. Commonwealth, the 60s,
Yes.
and now Lawrence Wong went as well.
Well, we just think about our recent free trade agreement, right? I mean,
Pacific Alliance.
in fact, you just look at my timetable this week. I spent the weekend with Malaysia, ASEAN. Yesterday, day before, I was meeting MPs from the Pacific Alliance, which means Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. In December 23, I signed a Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, which is Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. We've been to Africa, to Rwanda. We're exploring things there. We've upgraded our relations in the Middle East with the Gulf Cooperation Council. With Europe, we have the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. We have the EU-ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, which we help to broker. We are now associate members of the Pacific Island Forum. Can you see a pattern to all my frenetic traveling?
A lot of frequent flyer miles. No, I'm joking. No.
Which I have to pay for.
He doesn't get them free.
There are no free lunches.
Can I zoom back down? I mean, absolutely correct, but a lot of engagements everywhere. But you also said about how just the near abroad, if we continue to integrate, and you mentioned Malaysia.
Yeah.
I know you've spent a lot of time in Malaysia. You just got back. Would you say a few words about, in this global situation context, something about how we see the Johor, Singapore? And by the way, I've got a new acronym for you. The JSSEZ is just too much. I'm going to call it the Just Easy. Everything should just be easy between the two guys. So give me something in the global context with Just Easy.
Singapore and Malaysia are permanent neighbors. And even our composition of people, yes, the proportions are different, but actually the race, language, religions are fundamentally the same. Just proportions are different. In fact, if you take a wider lens and look at it from the Indonesian point of view, we are just another Riau island. Bintan is larger than Singapore, right? And depending on history, and this is where revisionist history can always get complicated. In 1964, McDonald House, which you can see from here, was bombed in Konfrontasi. And then we became part of Malaysia in 1963, to a large extent because the British did not believe that a city-state with a Chinese majority could be trusted not to go communist. Bear in mind, 1965, in the aftermath of the ascendancy of the Communist Party of China in 1949 and the ongoing communist insurgency. So we became part of Malaysia. Well, we then got divorced, but I often tell my colleagues in Malaysia, we're a couple that is divorced but still have to share the same bedroom.
It's complicated.
So it's complicated. But we can still do business. And if we, again, my point is take the long-term view. Understand that this game of mahjong will go on and on and on. And the game theory experts will tell you in these sort of games, actually playing it straight, playing it fair, on the basis of reciprocity, could say trust but verify, and never become dependent. And in the world of real politics, it makes a difference that everyone knows we will defend ourselves, and we are not asking for other blood. And any equipment that we buy, we pay market value for. And so I think those ingredients allow us to actually engage our neighbors. It's an honest relationship. And I would add that, do you recall, there was another acronym not so long ago called SIIA?
SIIA, yes.
Singapore, Johor, Riau. I will still keep that. Yes. As far as I'm concerned, that is still on the table. And we will watch this space.
Okay. The mahjong game can go on and on. And sadly, so could I, as before you old-timer. But we can't. So I'm going to call this to an end, sadly. We'll hear, of course, more about Singapore and SG60 through the year. But I hope this year opener and our speaker, Vivian Balakrishnan, our foreign minister, really helped us see how the SG60 sits in a truly global context. The challenges, the reserves, not just financial reserves, but the capacity and the reserves and the unity is emphasized, I think, are critical in going forward. So please join me in thanking our foreign minister.
Thank you.